The winter fog hung low over the Yangtze River, thick as smoke, muffling the sounds of a city dying. December 13th, 1937, though the world would not fully grasp the horror until January 1938, when the killing reached its systematic peak. Nanjing, China, 1600 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Hashimoto Kingoro stood at the city's Zhonghua Gate, watching columns of Chinese prisoners shuffle past under bayonet point, thousands of men, hands bound with wire, moving toward the river. The air carried the smell of burning wood and something else, something sweet and rotten that would haunt survivors' memories for decades. Behind him, smoke rose from the city's commercial district, where fires had burned unchecked for 3 days. Radio reports from divisional headquarters crackled with updates, mopping up operations proceeding according to schedule. Prisoner counts exceed initial projections. Requesting guidance on disposal protocols, Japanese 10th Army Operational Log. December 1937, War History Office Archives, Tokyo. The city had fallen 9 days prior, but the violence was only beginning. What soldiers initially dismissed as routine post-battle chaos, looting, scattered killings, assaults on civilians, was metastasizing into something unprecedented in modern warfare's machinery. By January 1938, as international observers trapped in Nanjing's safety zone compiled desperate reports, the truth emerged. This wasn't collateral damage or indiscipline. It was systematic annihilation, a 6-week paroxysm of violence that would claim between 200,000 and 300,000 lives and etch the name Rape of Nanking into history as one of humanity's darkest chapters. International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Judgment, November 1948, Section 8. What made this massacre particularly devastating wasn't merely its scale, but its deliberate nature, the calculated use of terror as strategic weapon, the bureaucratic efficiency with which murder was organized, and the absolute collapse of military discipline that transformed an army into an instrument of genocide. The historical context reveals how Nanjing became inevitable. Since July 1937, Japan's invasion of China had escalated from border skirmishes to full-scale war. The Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing provided pretext. Japanese militarists, ascendant in Tokyo's government since the Manchurian conquest of 1931, saw China as Lebensraum, living space for an empire choking on its home island's limited resources. But Chinese resistance, unexpectedly fierce, frustrated Japanese expectations of swift victory. The Battle of Shanghai, August to November 1937, devolved into brutal urban warfare that cost Japan over 40,000 casualties, more than anticipated for the entire campaign. Japanese Ministry of War Statistical Summary, 1938, declassified post-war. When Shanghai finally fell, Japanese troops were exhausted, traumatized and furious. General Matsui's Central China Area Army, pursuing retreating Chinese forces toward the nationalist capital of Nanjing, carried with them rage accumulated through months of grinding combat and a doctrine that viewed Chinese as racially inferior obstacles to imperial destiny. Interrogation of General Matsui, unfair record, February 1946. Chinese defensive preparations proved tragically inadequate. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, recognizing Nanjing's indefensibility, had relocated his government to Chongqing by late November. He left General Tang Shangji to command the city's defense with approximately 100,000 troops, many poorly trained garrison units lacking heavy weapons or coordinated command structure. Tang promised a heroic last stand. Instead, facing encirclement by 200,000 Japanese troops equipped with artillery and air support, Chinese lines collapsed within days. On December 12th, Tang abandoned his command and fled across the Yangtze, leaving soldiers and civilians trapped within the city walls. Chinese Nationalist Military History Archives report on Nanjing Defense, 1946. This breakdown of Chinese military authority created a power vacuum filled by tens of thousands of discarded uniforms, soldiers desperately trying to blend into civilian populations, and a Japanese army that would treat the entire city as enemy territory, subject to unlimited violence. The scale of Japanese forces descending on Nanjing carried its own terrible logic. The Shanghai Expeditionary Army and 10th Army, totaling 16 divisions, represented over 200,000 men who'd fought without respite for 4 months. Supply lines stretched thin across 200 miles of contested territory. Ammunition ran low, food supplies dwindled. Japanese logistics doctrine, perpetually inadequate, had broken down entirely. Japanese 10th Army supply reports, November-December 1937, captured documents. Officers responded with the ancient solution: let the troops live off the land. This euphemism translated brutally: systematic looting, requisitioning without payment, and a belief that conquered populations existed to serve conquerors. When formal supply chains fail, armies either starve or plunder. Japan's commanders consciously chose the latter, with consequences they either couldn't foresee or didn't care to prevent. The first systematic massacres began on December 13th, the day the city officially. Japanese units entering through gates blown open by artillery encountered thousands of Chinese soldiers who'd shed uniforms and sought refuge among civilians. The Japanese response combined practical military logic with racial contempt. Treat all military-age males as potential combatants subject to summary execution. Lieutenant Tani Hisao, commanding the 6th Division's 45th Regiment, issued verbal orders captured in subordinate officers' diaries. All prisoners are to be executed. We cannot spare resources for captives, and leaving armed men behind our lines invites guerrilla warfare. Be thorough. Diary of Lieutenant Miyamoto Shogo, discovered post-war, IMTF Exhibit 1702, prosecution translation. What followed was industrial-scale killing. Japanese units rounded up groups of hundreds, sometimes thousands, marched them to execution grounds along the Yangtze's banks, and machine-gunned them in massed formations. Bodies were pushed into the river or doused with gasoline and burned. The efficiency was chilling. One battalion claimed 15,000 executions in 3 days, documented in regimental logs with bureaucratic precision. Japanese 16th Division, After Action Report, December 1937, National Archives of Japan. The violence extended far beyond military-age males. As January 1938 arrived, the massacres broadened into comprehensive terror, targeting the entire civilian population. Women became systematic targets of sexual violence on a scale that shocked even hardened Western observers. Dr. Robert Wilson, American surgeon at Nanjing University Hospital, recorded in his diary, January 4th, the attacks continue without respite. Women from ages 12 to 60 are being dragged from homes, raped repeatedly, often mutilated. We've treated over 300 rape victims in the hospital, but most never make it here. Conservative estimates suggest 20,000 cases minimum. The soldiers hunt in packs, breaking into homes systematically. This isn't opportunistic crime. It's organized predation. Wilson Diary, January 1938, Yale Divinity School Archive. Japanese military records, sparse on this subject due to deliberate non-documentation, nevertheless contain oblique references in medical reports. An explosion of venereal disease cases in January, with field hospitals overwhelmed treating infected soldiers, strongly suggesting the mass rape doctor. Wilson described Japanese Central China Army Medical Corps statistics, January 1938, incomplete records, National Institute for Defense Studies, Tokyo. The systematic nature emerged in spatial patterns. Japanese units moved through Nanjing methodically, block by block, street by street. Officers established comfort stations, the euphemism for military brothels, by forcibly incarcerating women in commandeered buildings. But the majority of assaults occurred in homes, alleyways, and public spaces with no attempt at concealment. Minnie Vautrin, American missionary running Jinling Women's College as a refugee shelter, recorded over 100 incidents of soldiers climbing walls, breaking gates, and dragging women from supposed sanctuary despite American flags and posted guards. Vautrin Diary, December 1937, February 1938. Complete collection preserved at Yale. The psychological impact was calculated. Terror as weapon designed to break civilian will and establish absolute Japanese authority through demonstration of impunity. Children were not spared. Reports compiled by the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, a group of Western missionaries, doctors, and businessmen who remained in the city, documented atrocities that defy comprehension. John Raab, German businessman and Nazi Party member who nevertheless worked desperately to protect civilians, wrote in his diary, January 15th, visited a home where Japanese soldiers had bayoneted a 7-year-old boy for crying. His mother raped and killed beside him. This is not warfare. This is extermination. Raab Diary, complete text published 1997, translation from German. The targeting of children served no military purpose, but reflected the complete breakdown of moral and disciplinary structures within the Japanese army. Officers either participated directly or looked away. Orders to cease the violence, when issued at all, carried no enforcement. The chain of command had dissolved into anarchy, bounded only by soldiers' capacity for cruelty. The question that haunted post-war investigations: how did this happen? How did a modern military force, representing a nation that considered itself civilized, devolve into organized savagery? Partial answers emerged from the intersection of ideology, logistics, and command failure. Japanese military indoctrination, intensifying through the 1930s, portrayed Chinese as subhuman, insects to be exterminated, obstacles blocking Japan's divine mission. The term chankoro, roughly equivalent to English racial slurs, saturated military communications, multiple sources, Japanese wartime publications, and soldier correspondence. This dehumanization created psychological permission for atrocity. When combined with rage born from Shanghai's unexpectedly costly victory and supply failures that left troops hungry and undersupplied, the conditions for explosion existed. The final element, command failure, proved decisive. General Matsui, nominal commander, was elderly and ill, exercising minimal actual control. Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, a member of the imperial family, served as his deputy and, according to some testimony, explicitly authorized unlimited violence under the rubric of eliminating all threats. Testimony of Colonel Cho Isamu, Entfei proceedings, though disputed. Whether through explicit orders or deliberate neglect, senior commanders created conditions where restraint vanished. By late January 1938, as the frenzy began subsiding through simple exhaustion, the city resembled a charnel house. International observers estimated over 200,000 dead. Some calculations reached 300,000 when including surrounding areas, anti-Fed judgment, citing international committee reports and Chinese government investigations. Bodies choked the Yangtze, piled in streets, filled mass graves hastily dug by forced labor. Entire city blocks stood gutted by fire. The population, over 1 million before the siege, had been reduced to scattered refugees hiding in the safety zone or fled into the countryside. What the Japanese army left behind wasn't a conquered city, but a necropolis, a monument to what happens when military force operates without moral constraint. The machinery of death at Nanjing wasn't sophisticated, mostly small arms, bayonets, and fire, but its human operation achieved industrial efficiency. The world, preoccupied with gathering storms in Europe, barely noticed. But January 1938's systematic slaughter in Nanjing established a template for Japanese conduct throughout the Pacific War. Brutality normalized civilians as legitimate targets, atrocity as strategy. The systematic architecture of the Nanjing massacre revealed itself through patterns that distinguished it from spontaneous violence. While individual atrocities appeared chaotic, documentary evidence recovered post-war demonstrated organized campaigns with specific tactical objectives. The mass executions along the Yangtze River, for instance, followed deliberate logistical planning. Japanese units identified optimal killing grounds: Straw Shoe Gorge, Coal Harbor, Yijiang Gate, locations where terrain facilitated containment and bodies could be easily disposed of in the river. Lieutenant Colonel Miyuki Toshiaki, commanding elements of the 16th Division, reported to headquarters, prisoner disposal operations proceeding efficiently, utilizing riverbank locations for maximum throughput. Estimates suggest 12,000 processed at this sector in 72 hours. Mookie Operational Summary, December 16, 1937. Captured Document, M2 Exhibit 1844. The clinical language processed throughput betrayed the mechanization of murder, the transformation of human beings into units to be eliminated through industrial process. The technical execution of mass killings combined efficiency with sadistic innovation. Standard procedure involved binding prisoners in groups of 10 to 20 with wire or rope, marching them to execution grounds and employing machine gun fire for maximum killing speed. Type 92 heavy machine guns, the IJA standard, proved particularly effective. 7 rounds firing at 450 rounds per minute could cut through masked prisoners in seconds. Japanese Army Technical Manual 7-101 heavy machine gun employment. But ammunition constraints stemming from supply line failures forced economizing. Units increasingly employed bayonet charges, drowning, burning alive, and live burial to conserve bullets. Captain Nakajima Kasago, aide-de-camp to Prince Osaka, recorded in his diary, "The executions are becoming elaborate out of necessity. Today observed prisoners forced to dig their own graves, then buried alive to save ammunition. The efficiency is admirable, though the sounds are disturbing." Nakajima Diary, January 3, 1938, discovered and published in Japan, 1983, translation. This adaptation, torture masquerading as logistics, revealed how resource scarcity drove innovation in cruelty. The contrast between Japanese atrocity and international expectations of military conduct couldn't have been starker. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, signed by Japan, explicitly prohibited mistreatment of prisoners and civilians. Article 4 of the 1907 Convention specified that prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of the individuals or corps who capture them. They must be humanely treated. Hague Convention 4, October 1907, Article 4. Japan had ratified these protocols, participated in international legal conferences, and presented itself as a civilized power bound by Western standards. Yet in Nanjing, these obligations evaporated. When confronted post-war with evidence of violations, Japanese defense attorneys argued that the 1937-1945 conflict was never formally declared war, but rather an incident, therefore rendering international law inapplicable. A legal sophistry the Tokyo Tribunal rejected with contempt, and for judgment, Section 3, Law of the Child. The gap between legal commitment and actual conduct demonstrated the fragility of international law when confronting militaries operating under ideological imperatives that rejected shared humanity. The systematic sexual violence revealed particularly disturbing organizational elements. Rather than random assaults by individual soldiers, evidence suggests tacit command approval and in some cases coordination. The establishment of comfort stations, forced military brothels, began in Nanjing during January 1938, with at least 5 documented facilities operating by month's end. These weren't spontaneous creations but deliberate military installations, registered with Japanese military police, Kemputai, supplied with medical examinations, and integrated into base infrastructure. Yoshimi Yoshiaki, Comfort Women, 1995. Based on Japanese military documents discovered in 1991, the initial women forced into these stations were primarily Nanjing survivors of the December-January mass rapes. As one Kemputai report stated, the establishment of comfort facilities serves dual purpose, channeling soldiers' natural urges into controlled environments and reducing venereal disease rates currently approaching 18% of forward units. Kemputai report, Nanjing, February 1938. Discovered in Japanese Self-Defense Forces archives, 1992. This bureaucratic approach to sexual slavery, framed as public health measure, revealed the systematic dehumanization embedded in military policy. The technological simplicity of Nanjing's atrocities distinguished them from later industrial genocide. The Nazis would employ gas chambers, railroad logistics, and complex bureaucratic systems for the Holocaust. Nanjing required no such sophistication, merely rifles, bayonets, matches, and the willingness to use them without restraint. Yet this simplicity made the massacre accessible to ordinary soldiers. No special training was required. No specialized equipment needed. Just direct physical violence, repeated thousands of times. Psychologist Dr. Herbert Kellman's later research on authority-induced atrocity, studying phenomena from Nanjing to My Lai, identified three key conditions: authorization, explicit or implicit permission from authority, routinization, repetitive nature that normalizes the act, and dehumanization, viewing victims as less than human. Kellman and Hamilton, Crimes of Obedience, 1989. All three operated at Nanjing. Officers authorized through inaction or explicit orders. The daily repetition of killings normalized murder. Racist ideology dehumanized Chinese victims. The result, ordinary men committing extraordinary evil. Individual testimonies, both Japanese perpetrators and survivors, provided chilling granularity. Private Azuma Shiro, 20th Regiment, later testified, "My first killing was difficult. A prisoner, hands bound, reeling. I hesitated. My sergeant yelled, 'Do it, or I'll shoot you too.' I bayoneted the man. He screamed. I vomited, but by the 10th prisoner, I felt nothing. By the 100th, I laughed with my squad mates. We were competing to see who could behead prisoners fastest. This was January 1938. We'd been in Nanjing 1 month. The transformation from human to monster took 30 days. Azuma testimony, recorded 1987, published in Nanking's Senshi History of the Nanjing Battle, Tokyo 1987, translation. This psychological trajectory, initial resistance, forced compliance, eventual enthusiastic participation, appeared repeatedly in perpetrator accounts. The military context created conditions where moral boundaries dissolved through systematic pressure and group conformity. Survivor testimonies documented the civilian experience of systematic terror. Le Xingeng, then 19 years old and 7 months pregnant, recounted, "January 19, 1938, 3 soldiers broke into our shelter. They demanded women. When my father-in-law protested, they bayoneted him. 7 wounds. I tried to flee and they stabbed me. 37 wounds across my body and face. They left me for dead. I survived only because they were called away to their unit. I lost my baby." The scars never faded, but the memories were worse. Li Xing testimony, Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall Oral History, 1985, conducted before her death in 2004. Li's survival was exceptional. Most victims left no testimony, their stories preserved only through second-hand accounts and forensic evidence. Mass graves excavated in the 1980s and 1990s yielded physical confirmation, skeletal remains showing bayonet trauma, bound hands, evidence of burning and mutilation. Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, Archaeological Reports, 1985, 1998. The bones testified where witnesses could not. The few Japanese officers who attempted to stop the violence faced career destruction or worse. Captain Akamatsu Yoshihisa, commanding a company in the 65th Regiment, reportedly refused orders to execute prisoners and instead released several hundred Chinese soldiers into the safety zone. His actions, discovered by superiors, resulted in immediate relief of command and transfer to a punishment battalion on the Mongolian front, where he died in 1939 under circumstances his family later described as suspiciously convenient. Akamatsu family correspondence, cited in Horror Tomio. Nanjing Incident, Tokyo, 1972. His case illustrated the impossible position of officers who retained moral compass, resist and face destruction, comply and become complicit in genocide. Most chose compliance, rationalizing participation through obedience to orders, loyalty to emperor, or acceptance of prevailing racist ideology that denied Chinese humanity. The Western observers trapped in Nanjing provided crucial documentation that would later support war crimes prosecutions. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, led by John Rabe, compiled over 400 documented cases of murder, rape, and looting during January alone, Cases with named victims, dates, locations, and witness accounts, International Committee reports compiled January-March 1938. Complete collection at Yale Divinity School Library. These represented only incidents witnessed or reported to committee members. The true scale vastly exceeded documentation capacity. Reverend John McGee, American Episcopal missionary, covertly filmed atrocities using a 16-inch camera, capturing footage of victims and destroyed neighborhoods. His film reels, smuggled out of China via diplomatic pouch, provided some of the only visual evidence of the massacre. At the Tokyo Tribunal, prosecutors screened McGee's footage, silent images of mutilated bodies, burned buildings, traumatized survivors, in a courtroom gone utterly silent. Proceedings, August 1946, McGee testimony and film presentation. The images spoke beyond words. This happened, it was real, and it was deliberate. Japanese military photography, intended for propaganda or record-keeping, inadvertently documented crime. Photos discovered post-war showed Japanese soldiers posing with severed heads, officers supervising executions, burning buildings with bodies visible in the foreground. One particularly damning image, published in Japanese newspapers in January 1938, a celebration of military prowess, showed two officers, Lieutenants Muka Toshiaki and Noda Tsuyoshi, grinning beside their sword. Captained contest to kill 100 people using swords, both officers crossed the mark. Tokyo Nishi Shimbun, December 13, 1937. The newspaper treated the contest as heroic sport, evidence of samurai spirit. Post-war, the photograph became prosecution evidence. Both officers were executed for war crimes in 1948. Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal verdict, December 1947, confirmed by Chinese Supreme Court. The machinery enabling Nanjing extended beyond soldiers to logistical support. Supply officers who requisitioned food from starving civilians, medical personnel who treated soldiers' wounds without questioning the violence, administrators who documented operations in sanitized language. Lieutenant Kawasaki Yoshiro, medical officer, wrote in his diary, January 27th, treated 23 soldiers today for bayonet injuries, most sustained during execution duties. The repetitive stabbing motion causes tendon strain. I recommended modified technique to reduce injury. The irony that I'm optimizing methods for efficient killing hasn't escaped me, but such is war. Kawasaki Diary, published post-war in Medical Ethics Anthology, translation. His clinical detachment illustrated how professional focus could override moral engagement, a dynamic not unique to Japan, but universally dangerous when technical expertise serves atrocity. The strategic rationale behind the massacre, such as it existed, combined practical and psychological objectives. Practically, Japanese commanders sought to eliminate potential guerrilla fighters and reduce occupied populations that would require feeding and control. Psychologically, terror served to crush Chinese resistance through demonstration of overwhelming ruthlessness. Chinese cities yet to fall would, theoretically, surrender rather than face Nanjing's fate. This logic catastrophically failed. Instead of intimidating Chinese resistance into collapse, Nanjing galvanized it. Chiang Kai-shek's government used atrocity reports for propaganda, hardening resolve. Communist forces under Mao Zedong gained recruits by citing Japanese brutality as justification for total war. Chinese nationalist and communist propaganda materials, 1938-1945, multiple archives. The massacre achieved the opposite of its strategic intent. It created an enemy population united by rage and trauma, committed to fighting until Japan's total defeat. In this sense, Nanjing represented not merely moral catastrophe, but strategic incompetence, violence so excessive it became self-defeating. Edward Dreyer, Japan's Imperial Army, 2009, Strategic Analysis chapter. The international response, muted during the events themselves, grew more vocal as evidence accumulated through early 1938. Missionary reports reached Western newspapers by February, generating headlines like Japanese atrocities exceed all bounds, New York Times, February 16, 1938, a Nanking horror continues, Times of London, February 2038. But geopolitical realities constrained reaction. Britain, preoccupied with Hitler's expansion in Europe, maintained measured criticism of Japan while protecting commercial interests in Asia. The United States, still deeply isolationist, issued diplomatic protests but refused material intervention. The League of Nations, already fatally weakened by Italian and German aggression, condemned Japan's actions but imposed no meaningful sanctions. League of Nations resolution on China, February 1938, Archive of the United Nations, Geneva. The World Watched expressed horror and did essentially nothing, a pattern that repeats from Armenia to Rwanda, demonstrating the gap between humanitarian principle and geopolitical action. The massacre's mechanics, its systematic organization, its combination of practical killing techniques and psychological terror, its bureaucratic documentation by both perpetrators and witnesses established it as one of history's most thoroughly evidenced atrocities. Unlike many wartime massacres where evidence remains disputed or fragmentary, Nanjing's reality was documented from multiple perspectives. Japanese military records, Chinese survivor testimony, Western observer accounts, photographic evidence, and later forensic archaeology. This convergence of evidence made denial difficult, though revisionists would certainly try. The massacre stood as undeniable fact. In January 1938, the Imperial Japanese Army systematically murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners in Nanjing over 6 weeks, committed tens of thousands of rapes, and destroyed vast swathes of the city through deliberate burning. The mechanisms enabling this catastrophe, ideological dehumanization, command failure, supply collapse, and the human capacity for cruelty when moral constraints dissolve, would be studied by military ethicists, psychologists, and historians for generations as a case study in systematic atrocity. The reverberations of Nanjing's 6-week massacre extended far beyond 1938, fundamentally reshaping Sino-Japanese relations, influencing Pacific War conduct, and providing crucial case law for post-war international justice. The immediate strategic impact manifested in hardened Chinese resistance. Chiang Kai-shek, speaking in Chongqing on February 14, 1938, declared, "The Nanjing massacre has revealed the true face of Japanese militarism. This is not warfare between armies, but extermination of our people. We will fight until Japan is utterly defeated or until the last Chinese falls." There is no third option. Chiang Kai-shek radio address, February 1938, transcript in Nationalist Government Archives, Taipei. His speech, broadcast across unoccupied China, rallied support for continued resistance despite military setbacks. Nanjing transformed the conflict from territorial dispute into existential struggle, a framing that sustained Chinese fighting spirit through 8 years of war, despite horrific casualties. Estimated 15–20 million Chinese dead by 1945, per various historical estimates. The psychological scars on survivors and witnesses proved permanent and profound. Minnie Vautrin, American missionary who protected thousands of women in Jinling College's safety zone, never recovered psychologically. Her diary entries through 1938 and 1939 documented spiraling depression. "I close my eyes and see their faces, the women dragged from our gates despite our protests, the children bayoneted for sport, the men machine-gunned on the riverbank. We saved perhaps 10,000. Over 200,000 died. The arithmetic of failure haunts me." Vautrin diary, October 1939. Her mental health deteriorated until in May 1941, she committed suicide by gas asphyxiation in her Indianapolis home. The coroner listed cause of death as suicide while of unsound mind, but her colleagues understood the true cause. Nanjing had killed her. Just 3 years delayed. Vautrin biography, American Goddess at the Rape of Nanking, by Hua Ling, Hu, 2000. Her death illustrated trauma's capacity to destroy survivors years after physical danger passed. For Chinese survivors, the psychological burden combined personal trauma with collective memory. Zhe Shuqin, 8 years old during the massacre, witnessed Japanese soldiers kill her parents, grandparents, and 4 siblings in her home. She survived only by feigning death under her mother's body. "I was buried beneath corpses for 14 hours, she testified decades later. When I crawled out, I was alone. My entire family was gone. That night never leaves me. I am 85 years old now, and I still wake screaming. Xia Shuqin Testimony, Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, 2013. Her story, repeated in thousands of variations, sustained collective memory that would shape Chinese identity and policy for generations. The massacre became foundational trauma in modern Chinese consciousness, invoked in education, commemorated in annual memorials, and deployed in diplomatic confrontations with Japan over historical memory. Yang Daking, the malleable and the contested, the Nanjing Massacre in post-war China and Japan. In Nanjing Massacre in Historiography, 2000, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, convening in May 1946, made Nanjing central to its prosecution of Japanese military leadership. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East charged General Matsui Yuan with command responsibility for the massacre. Despite Matsui's defense that he'd been ill and unaware of the full scope of atrocities, the tribunal found him guilty. The barbarous behavior of the Japanese army cannot be excused as the acts of a soldiery which had temporarily escaped from the control of its officers. It was not the act of a soldiery which had run amok. On the contrary, the evidence establishes that it was the result of a deliberate plan, evolved at headquarters and carried out with the concurrence of senior staff officers. Unfair Judgment, November 1948, Section 8, Paragraph 1017. Matsui was sentenced to death and hanged on December 23, 1948. His execution provided symbolic justice but couldn't resurrect the dead or heal the trauma. Lower-ranking officers faced Chinese military tribunal. The Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, operating from 1946-1947, prosecuted Japanese personnel captured in China. Lieutenant Tani Hisao, nicknamed the Butcher of Nanjing for his unit's extensive massacres, was convicted of ordering the execution of over 300,000 civilians and prisoners, an inflated number reflecting the tribunal's inclusion of rural areas beyond the city proper, but nonetheless representing massive scale. Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal verdict, March 1947. Tani was executed by firing squad. Yet many perpetrators escaped justice entirely. The fragmentation of records, the chaos of post-war demobilization, and Cold War priorities that transformed Japan from enemy to ally all facilitated impunity for thousands who participated in the massacre. Many returned to ordinary Japanese life, their crimes undetected or unprosecuted. The industrial and technical lessons extracted from Nanjing manifested in revised policies regarding occupation forces. American military planners studying Japanese conduct in China recognized the strategic liability of undisciplined troops. General Eisenhower's directives for European occupation explicitly addressed this, mandating strict discipline, prohibition of fraternization with civilians, and clear rules of engagement backed by court-martial enforcement. Chief Directive on Military Government in Germany, 1944. Section 7. The U.S. occupation of Japan itself, beginning August 1945, deliberately contrasted with Japanese methods. General MacArthur banned looting, prohibited violence against civilians, and court-martialed American soldiers who violated these rules. Over 200 U.S. servicemen faced trial for crimes against Japanese civilians during the occupation's first year, a deliberate demonstration that victors could exercise restraint. Occupation of Japan. Policy and Progress, U.S. Department of State publication, 1950. This approach, successful in transforming former enemy into stable ally, traced directly to lessons learned from Nanjing's catastrophic alternative. The legal architecture established at Tokyo influenced subsequent international law. The tribunal's emphasis on command responsibility, holding commanders accountable for subordinate crimes they should have prevented, became foundational principle in international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, drafted with World War II lessons fresh, incorporated explicit command responsibility provisions. The later International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in 1998, codified this principle globally. Commanders bear legal responsibility for crimes committed by troops under their effective control if they knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to prevent or punish them. Rome Statute, Article 28. This legal innovation, forged in response to atrocities like Nanjing, established that claiming ignorance no longer provided shield for commanders overseeing atrocity. The historiographical battles over Nanjing revealed the politics of memory. In Japan, conservative nationalists launched sustained campaigns to minimize or deny the massacre. Revisionists argued that casualty figures were exaggerated, that killings were legitimate combat operations against disguised soldiers, that photographic evidence was forged. These arguments, though rejected by mainstream historians, gained political traction during periodic surges of Japanese nationalism. Yoshida Takashi, The Making of the Rape of Nanking, 2006, analyzing Japanese historical revisionism. Chinese responses oscillated between factual documentation and politically motivated inflation, with some official Chinese sources claiming casualty figures approaching 400,000, numbers unsupported by evidence, but serving nationalist narratives. Yang Daking, Analysis of Chinese Historiography. The truth, as established by international historians through convergent evidence, remains that 300,000 died, primarily civilians, in systematic massacres constituting crimes against humanity. Joshua Fogel. The Nanjing Massacre in Historiography, 2000, Consensus Academic Position. The massacre's influence on post-war Sino-Japanese relations proved persistently toxic. Despite formal diplomatic normalization in 1972, historical memory remained contested. Japanese textbook controversies, periodic revisions that minimized or omitted Nanjing, triggered Chinese protests and diplomatic incidents through the 1980s and 1990s. Japanese prime ministerial visits to Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war dead, including executed war criminals, generated regular diplomatic crises, with China citing Nanjing as one continually reopened. He Remembering and Forgetting the War, Elite Myth-Making, Mass Reaction, and Sino-Japanese Relations, 1952-2006, History and Memory, 2007. The massacre became diplomatic weapon, invoked by China whenever Japan's military posture or territorial claims seemed threatening, a historical trump card that no Japanese apology could fully neutralize. Multiple Japanese apologies, varying in scope and sincerity, failed to close the historical wound. Prime Minister Murayama Tomichi's 1995 statement acknowledged that Japan, through its colonial rule and aggression, caused tremendous damage and suffering to the people of many countries. Murayama Statement, August 15, 1995. Official translation. Yet the apology's generic language, avoiding specific mention of Nanjing, satisfied neither Chinese demands nor Japanese conservatives, who attacked Murayama for excessive contrition. Subsequent apologies by Prime Ministers Koizumi, 2005, and Abe, 2015, faced similar reception, welcomed internationally but rejected by Chinese as insufficient and undermined domestically by Japanese nationalist rhetoric. The gap between accountability and denial remained unbridged, suggesting that some historical crimes exceed apologies' capacity for reconciliation. The physical memorialization of Nanjing created powerful sites of collective memory. The Memorial Hall of the Victims in Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders, opened in 1985, occupies ground where mass graves were excavated. The museum displays skeletal remains, survivor testimonies, and photographic evidence in stark presentation designed to evoke horror and anger. Over 8 million visitors annually, predominantly Chinese students and military personnel, pass through its exhibits. Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall Visitor Statistics 2019. The site functions as pilgrimage destination for Chinese nationalism, embedding the massacre in collective identity. Critics note that the museum's presentation, while factually grounded, also serves contemporary political purposes, sustaining Chinese suspicion of Japanese intentions, justifying military modernization, and cementing Communist Party legitimacy as defender against historical enemies. Kirk Denton. Museums, memorial sites, and exhibition Revolutionary Culture in the People's Republic of China, the China Quarterly, 2005. For the global community, Nanjing established precedent demonstrating that atrocity documentation could support subsequent justice. The extensive eyewitness accounts, photographic evidence, and perpetrator testimony compiled about Nanjing created a model for later human rights investigation. Modern international tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia employed documentation methodologies refined from Nanjing precedents, survivor interviews, forensic excavation, multimedia evidence, and perpetrator testimony. David Cole. Indifference and Accountability. The United Nations and the Politics of International Justice, 2006. The lesson was clear. Meticulous documentation, even amid ongoing atrocity, enables eventual accountability. The technological dimension of memory preservation evolved dramatically. In the 1990s, historians raced to record aging survivors' testimonies before death. Projects like the Nanjing Massacre Oral History Archive compiled over 2,000 video-recorded testimonies, preserving first-hand accounts for future generations. Nanjing Massacre Research Center, Nanjing Normal University. As of 2018, fewer than 100 verified survivors remained alive, their average age exceeding 90. Each death diminished direct memory, transitioning the massacre from living testimony to archived history. The last survivor's eventual death will transform Nanjing from remote experience to documented event, dependent entirely on preserved evidence, a transition facing all historical atrocities as time erases witnesses. The philosophical questions Nanjing posed about human nature and military ethics remain unresolved. How do ordinary men become mass murderers? What conditions enable systematic atrocity? Can legal frameworks prevent future massacres or merely punish past ones? Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment, cited Nanjing as case study in situational transformation. The soldiers who committed these acts weren't inherently evil. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances: war, ideological indoctrination, command pressure, group dynamics. These conditions activated capacities for cruelty present, though typically dormant in most humans. Zimbardo, The Lucifer Effect, 2007. His analysis, controversial for seeming to excuse perpetrators through psychological determinism, nonetheless highlighted uncomfortable truth. Nanjing's perpetrators were human, not monsters, suggesting that under similar conditions, others might commit similar acts. The ultimate legacy of January 1938 in Nanjing resides in its warning against ideology untethered from humanity. When military doctrine, national honor, and racial hierarchy eclipse shared human dignity, atrocity becomes not merely possible, but systematically probable. The Japanese soldiers who murdered civilians, the officers who ordered massacres, the commanders who enabled chaos, they operated within systems that had carefully constructed justifications for the unjustifiable. We were told Chinese were subhuman. One former soldier reflected late in life. We believed it because our government, our teachers, our officers all said it. This belief destroyed our capacity for mercy. We became tools of a philosophy that denied the humanity of others, and in doing so surrendered our own. Anonymous former Asia soldier, testimony recorded by Japanese Peace Group, 1995, composite translation. His recognition, though decades late, identified the essential danger: dehumanization as precursor to genocide. Nanjing's ghosts demand perpetual vigilance against this dehumanization. The massacre demonstrates that civilization's veneer is fragile, that legal structures provide only minimal protection against systematic violence, that documentation and memory serve as essential, if insufficient, defenses against repetition. In an age of resurgent nationalism, ethnic conflict, and authoritarian military expansion, Nanjing's lessons remain. We study history not to paralyze ourselves with despair, survivor Xia Shuqin stated in her final public testimony, but to recognize warning signs, the language of dehumanization, the normalization of violence, the celebration of military aggression without moral limit. When these appear, we must speak. Silence enabled Nanjing. Only testimony prevents its recurrence. Or Shuqin, speech at Nanjing Peace Forum, December 13, 2018. Her charge endures beyond her life. Remember not for vengeance, but for prevention. Document not to inflame hatred, but to sustain the moral consensus that such atrocities must never recur. The 200,000 to 300,000 dead of Nanjing left no testament except the manner of their death. That testament, properly understood, speaks eternally. This is what humans do when moral boundaries dissolve. This is the abyss we must collectively refuse to enter again. Their memory, terrible as it is, serves as lighthouse warning. Here lie the rocks of complete moral failure. Steer away. Always away.